Hey guys, welcome back. Let's talk about one of the most terrifying unsolved cases in American history. Picture this. It's the 1930s, the Great Depression has Cleveland by the throat, and there's a killer stalking the streets who makes Jack the Ripper look like a rookie. But here's the kicker. This maniac managed to outwit one of America's most legendary lawmen, the very same guy who brought down Al Capone. I'm talking about the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. And trust me, this story will keep you awake tonight. Now, our story begins on September 23rd, 1935. Two young boys are taking a shortcut through a place called Kingsbury Run, basically Cleveland's version of Hell on Earth. Picture a sprawling ravine filled with hobo camps, railroad tracks, and the kind of people society had forgotten about. The kids are minding their own business when they stumble upon something that would scar them for life. Not one, but two headless, naked bodies lying in the weeds. But here's where it gets absolutely mental. Both victims had been washed clean, drained of blood, and their heads were buried separately, dozens of feet away. Someone had taken their sweet time with this gruesome display. The police report described finding an old blue coat, light cap, and blood-stained union suit nearby, along with a metal bucket containing oil and a torch. This wasn't some heat-of-the-moment killing. This was methodical, calculated, and absolutely terrifying. The first victim was later identified as Edward Andrassy, a 29-year-old hospital orderly with a sketchy past. The second man? Well, he remains a mystery to this day, just like so many others who would follow. What made this case particularly chilling wasn't just the brutality, it was the precision. Coroner Samuel Gerber, who would become Cleveland's legendary coroner, noted something that sent shivers down every investigator's spine. Whoever did this had surgical knowledge. The cuts were clean, professional, made by someone who knew exactly where to slice. No hesitation marks, no amateur fumbling, just cold, clinical dismemberment. On January 26, 1936, parts of a woman were discovered near Orange Avenue. This victim, later identified as Florence Polillo, had been chopped into pieces and scattered across multiple locations. The killer was sending a message. I can do this whenever I want, wherever I want, and you can't stop me. And you know what the most disturbing part was? The killer seemed to be getting better at it. By 1936, Cleveland was in full panic mode. 6 murders in 1 year, bodies turning up with the regularity of a gruesome newsletter, and the police hadn't a clue. The newspapers were having a field day with headlines like "The Mad Butcher Strikes Again" and "Who is this mad torso killer?" Enter Elliot Ness. Yes, that Elliot Ness, the square-jawed hero who supposedly brought down Al Capone with his band of untouchables. Cleveland's mayor Harold Burton appointed him safety director, thinking if anyone could catch this maniac, it would be the guy who cleaned up Chicago. But here's something they don't tell you in the movies. Ness was actually in his early 30s, had limited detective experience, and was more of a publicity hound than a master investigator. The FBI had actually passed on hiring him after Prohibition ended, considering him too much of a glory seeker. Cleveland was his chance to prove himself again. Little did he know, he was about to meet his match. In the summer of 1936, something happened that would become one of the case's most haunting mysteries. A victim was found decapitated near the railroad tracks, but this one was different. This man was covered in 6 distinctive tattoos, a bird and band with the names Helen and Paul on his left forearm, a heart and anchor, and the initials WCG. Now you'd think with all those identifying marks he'd be easy to identify, right? Wrong. The police went all out. They fingerprinted him, photographed every tattoo, even made a plaster cast of his reconstructed face. Then they did something unprecedented. They put his head and tattoo diagrams on display at the Great Lakes Exposition of 1936, one of the biggest events of the year. Over 100,000 people saw that display. Can you imagine? Thousands upon thousands of people walking past, staring at those tattoos, and not a single person could identify him. This wasn't just any random victim. Someone, somewhere knew this man. Someone had inked those names on his arm. Someone cared enough to put Helen and Paul permanently on his body. But whoever they were, they never came forward. The tattooed man remains nameless to this day, a ghost with a face but no identity. In July 1936, something unprecedented happened. A victim was found on the west side of Cleveland, near a homeless camp in the Big Creek area. This was miles from Kingsbury Run, breaking the killer's established pattern. What made this discovery particularly chilling was that for the first time, the killer had murdered his victim at the location where the body was found. A pathologist discovered a massive quantity of dried blood that had seeped into the ground. This poor soul had been killed right there on the spot. The killer was becoming bolder, more confident, almost taunting the authorities. By fall of 1936, with 6 brutal killings and 0 suspects, the authorities tried something new for the era: criminal profiling. Coroner Pierce organised what newspapers dubbed a torso clinic, bringing together police, medical experts and criminologists to create a psychological profile of the killer. What they came up with was terrifying in its implications. The killer was incredibly strong enough to carry dismembered bodies up the steep embankments of Kingsbury Run, where cars couldn't reach. He had extensive anatomical knowledge, possibly medical training. He killed somewhere else and transported the bodies to dump sites, indicating he had access to a private location and transportation. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to be selecting victims from society's most vulnerable: drifters, prostitutes, people who wouldn't be immediately missed. This wasn't some crazed maniac killing in a frenzy. This was a predator who planned meticulously, selected his victims carefully, and had the skills to cover his tracks. The Cleveland Police Department assigned detectives Peter Merylo and Martin Zalewski to the case full-time, and these 2 men would become obsessed with catching the killer. Merylo in particular did something that sounds like it's straight out of a noir film. He went undercover as a hobo. Picture this: a Cleveland police detective, dressed in rags, sleeping in shanty towns, riding the rails with vagrants, trying to get inside the killer's world. Merylo was convinced the murderer was targeting transients who rode the railroad lines, and he was willing to make himself bait to prove it. The dedication was extraordinary. By the time the case ran its course, Merylo and Zalewski had interviewed over 1,500 people. The department as a whole questioned more than 5,000 individuals. It was the biggest police investigation in Cleveland's history, and they were no closer to catching their man. Throughout 1937, the bodies kept appearing with clockwork regularity. On February 23rd, the upper half of a woman's torso washed up on the shores of Lake Erie. In June, the skeleton of a man was discovered under the Lorain-Carnegie Bridge. July brought another torso floating in the Cuyahoga River. Each discovery sent fresh waves of terror through the city. The killer seemed unstoppable, almost supernatural in his ability to commit these atrocities without leaving a trace of evidence. The newspapers were calling him Cleveland's Jack the Ripper, but this was arguably worse. Jack the Ripper killed his victims quickly. The mad butcher was taking his time, often decapitating his victims while they were still alive. By 1938, Elliot Ness was feeling the heat. His reputation as an untouchable crime fighter was crumbling under the weight of this unsolved case. The press was brutal, the public was terrified, and his political patrons were losing patience. He cleaned up corrupt cops, busted labor racketeers, even taken on the Cleveland mob. But this one case was destroying everything he'd built. Then, in April 1938, something happened that would push Ness over the edge. The torso of a woman was found floating in the Cuyahoga River in 2 burlap bags. For the first time, the coroner found drugs in a victim's system: morphine. Had the killer started sedating his victims before butchering them? This 10th victim was apparently too much for Ness to handle through conventional means. He was about to do something that would define the rest of his career, something that would show just how desperate he'd become. What I'm about to tell you wasn't revealed until the 1980s, decades after most of the key players had died. In May 1938, Elliot Ness authorized something that would be completely illegal today: the kidnapping and secret interrogation of a suspect. His name was Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney, and on paper, he was the perfect suspect. Born in 1894 into an impoverished Irish family living on the edge of Kingsbury Run, Sweeney had clawed his way out of poverty through sheer intelligence and determination. He'd worked his way through medical school, become a surgical resident, and seemed destined for success. But something went horribly wrong. Sweeney had served in World War I as part of a medical unit that conducted battlefield amputations. He'd suffered nerve damage from a gas attack and received a partial disability pension. After the war, he'd married, had 2 children, and started building a life. But by 1929, the pressure was getting to him. He started drinking heavily, became violent at home, and his marriage fell apart. His wife filed for divorce in 1936, seeking a restraining order to keep him away from her and the children. But here's what made Sweeney such a compelling suspect. He lived near Kingsbury Run. He had the surgical knowledge to dismember bodies with precision. And, most importantly, he had a cousin who was a powerful congressman. If word got out that Martin Sweeney's cousin was the prime suspect in the Torso murders, it could create a political scandal. So Ness decided to handle this quietly. Ness had his men literally kidnap Sweeney off the streets of downtown Cleveland and take him to a darkened suite at the Cleveland Hotel. For over a week, they held him there without charges, without a lawyer, without any of the legal protections we take for granted today. Ness himself led the interrogation, trying to break the man he was convinced was the butcher. According to David Cowles, the head of Cleveland's Scientific Identification Bureau, who participated in the interrogation, they gave Sweeney a lie detector test. He failed spectacularly, but failing a polygraph isn't evidence of murder. It just meant he was nervous, which any innocent man would be after being kidnapped by the police. For days they grilled him about the murders, showed him crime scene photos, tried every psychological trick in the book. But Sweeney never confessed. He never admitted to anything. And without physical evidence, without witnesses, without anything concrete linking him to the crimes, Ness had to let him go. But the story doesn't end there. On August 16, 1938, 2 more bodies were discovered. Victims 11 and 12. They were found at a dump site that could be seen directly from Elliot Ness's office window. It was almost as if the killer was taunting him, leaving his latest victims where Cleveland's top lawman would be sure to notice them. 2 days later, Ness snapped. On August 18th at 12:40 a.m., Ness led a raid on the shanty towns of Kingsbury Run with 35 police officers and detectives. They arrested dozens of homeless men, and then, in a move that would haunt his reputation forever, Ness ordered the shanty towns burned to the ground. In the middle of the Great Depression, when people were struggling just to survive, Cleveland's safety director ordered the destruction of the only shelter these desperate men had. The public was outraged. The newspapers called it misguided zeal and compared it to the worst civil rights violations in the city's history. But here's the thing that nobody expected. The murders stopped. 2 weeks after the raids, Dr. Francis Sweeney checked himself into the Sandusky Soldiers and Sailors Home for veterans. The torso murders of Cleveland came to an abrupt end. Coincidence? Ness didn't think so. For the next 16 years until Ness's death in 1957, someone claiming to be F.E. Sweeney sent him taunting postcards. They were mostly incoherent ramblings, but they consistently mocked Ness for his failure to solve the case. The postcards were signed F.E. Sweeney, Paranoidal Sick Nemesis. In 1954, one postcard read,
"You can rest easy now as I have come out to sunny California for the winter."
The sender claimed to have killed someone and buried their head on Century Boulevard in Los Angeles. No body was ever found, but the timing is interesting. This was 7 years after the Black Dahlia murder in Los Angeles, another case involving surgical precision and body dismemberment. Could the mad butcher have moved to California? Could he have been responsible for other unsolved cases across the country? We'll never know for certain. Meanwhile, back in Cleveland, the authorities tried to save face by arresting a scapegoat. In August 1939, they picked up Frank Dolezal, a 52-year-old bricklayer who had once lived with victim Florence Polillo and knew Edward Andraschi and Rose Wallace, the only other victims who were ever positively identified. Under brutal interrogation, and I mean brutal, Dolezal confessed to killing Polillo. But his confession was a bizarre mix of incoherent ramblings and suspiciously detailed knowledge, almost as if he'd been coached. Before he could go to trial, Dolezal was found dead in his cell, supposedly having hanged himself from a hook that was lower than his own height. An autopsy revealed 6 broken ribs that he'd received while in police custody. Nobody believed Dolezal was the real killer, but he made a convenient story for the newspapers. For decades, the official story was that the torso murders remained unsolved. But in the 1980s, researcher James Badal started digging into the case and uncovered the truth about Ness's secret suspect. Through interviews with surviving investigators and family members, Badal was able to prove that Dr. Francis Sweeney was indeed the man Ness had interrogated in that hotel room. The evidence against Sweeney is circumstantial but compelling. He lived near Kingsbury Run and knew the area intimately. He had the surgical skills necessary to dismember bodies with such precision. His drinking and violent episodes coincided with the timeline of the murders. He had access to medical facilities where the dismemberments could have taken place. Most importantly, immediately after his interrogation and subsequent commitment to a mental institution, the murders stopped completely. In 1956, Sweeney was diagnosed as schizophrenic. He spent the rest of his life in and out of mental institutions until his death in 1964. But here's what makes this case so frustrating. We'll never have absolute proof. All the official police records on the case have been lost, destroyed, or mysteriously removed from the files. The physical evidence is gone, the witnesses are dead. We're left with a compelling theory, but no way to prove it definitively. the Cleveland torso murders destroyed Elliot Ness's reputation and effectively ended his career as a lawman. After his disastrous handling of the case, he never recovered his status as America's top crime fighter. He died in 1957, largely forgotten, his legend only revived years later by Hollywood myth-making. The case also marked an important moment in criminal investigation history, the use of criminal profiling, the coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, the attempt to use media and public exposure to identify victims. All of these techniques would become standard practice in later decades. But perhaps most importantly, the case shows us something disturbing about the nature of evil. The Mad Butcher wasn't some raving lunatic attacking people in dark alleys. He was methodical, intelligent, and careful. He selected victims who wouldn't be missed, killed them in private locations, and disposed of the evidence with surgical precision. He understood that in a society where some people matter more than others, he could prey on the forgotten without consequence. Most of his victims were drifters, prostitutes, and homeless people, individuals who existed on the margins of society. Even today, nearly 90 years later, 10 of his 12 confirmed victims remain unidentified. In 2024, the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office partnered with the DNA Doe Project to exhume some of the victims and use modern genetic genealogy techniques to finally identify them. They've already begun the process of digging up remains that have been buried in unmarked graves for nearly a century. It's a race against time. The remains are old, potentially contaminated, and degraded. But if they can extract usable DNA, they might finally be able to give names to some of these forgotten victims. And who knows, maybe identifying the victims will provide new clues about their killer. So here we are nearly 90 years later, and the biggest question remains unanswered. Was Dr. Francis Sweeney really the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run? The circumstantial evidence is strong, the timeline fits perfectly. The skills and knowledge required match his background. The psychological profile is consistent with his documented mental illness and violent behaviour. Most tellingly, the murders stopped when he was institutionalized and continued to stop as long as he remained under supervision. But circumstantial evidence isn't proof, and proof is what we'd need to close this case definitively. Some researchers have suggested there might not have been a single killer at all, that the murders could have been committed by different people. Others believe the real butcher was a transient who rode the rails, which would explain similar murders found in other states along railroad lines. Detective Peter Merillo, who spent the rest of his career obsessed with this case, believed until his death in 1958 that the killer was indeed a transient. He'd found similar murders in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and other states, all connected by railroad lines, all involving the same surgical precision and decapitation methods. But if that were true, why did the murders stop so abruptly in 1938? Why did they never resume with the same intensity anywhere else? The truth is, we may never know for certain who the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run really was. The physical evidence is gone, the witnesses are dead, and time has erased too many crucial details. We're left with theories, speculation, and the haunting knowledge that somewhere in Cleveland's past, a monster walked among ordinary people and was never brought to justice. What we do know is that 12 people, and possibly many more, died horrific deaths at the hands of someone with both the skill to dismember human bodies and the complete lack of empathy necessary to do it repeatedly. We know that America's most famous lawman met his match in this unknown killer and never recovered from the failure. And we know that even today, in an age of DNA testing and advanced forensic science, some mysteries remain unsolved, some monsters remain unnamed, and some victims remain forgotten. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run got away with it. In a world where we expect justice to prevail and the good guys to win, that's a deeply unsettling thought. But perhaps that's the real lesson of this case. Evil doesn't always look like what we expect. It doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes or leave convenient clues. Sometimes it hides behind a doctor's training, operates with surgical precision, and disappears into the shadows of history. Somewhere in Cleveland, in an unmarked grave, Dr. Francis Sweeney lies silent. If he was indeed the Mad Butcher, he took his secrets with him. If he wasn't, then the real killer's identity died with him decades ago. Either way, the case of the Cleveland torso murderer remains what it's always been, a reminder that some questions have no answers, some mysteries have no solutions, and some monsters are never caught. The only thing we can do now is remember the victims, even if we don't know their names, and hope that someday, somehow, science will succeed where Elliot Ness failed. Until then, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run remains what he's always been, the serial killer that nobody could catch,